Welcome to MIT versus Caltech. My name is Sam Wilkie. I got my chemical engineering bachelor's from Caltech, then went on to get my PhD from Berkeley, where I studied chemical engineering, but really it was more electrochemistry and quantum physics. Then I did data science and was able to retire in my 30s. And since then, I have devoted a lot of my time and attention to not just well-being, but also interesting questions to me, like why does the world exist? Abe?
Thanks, Sam. I'm Abe McAllister. I graduated from MIT with degrees in electrical engineering and computer science, minor in material science engineering, bachelor's and master's. I went on to do a couple hardware tech startups in the Boston area. I got married, had 3 kids. My wife finished her PhD. We moved down to Virginia. I transitioned careers into finance. That's where I've been for the last 15 years. I think a lot about living life deliberately, and it was great to meet Sam just a couple months ago. I think we really hit it off, and I think having some similar and different views of life and our time here, and being super thankful for, existing, and we wanted to, kind of share those conversations with whoever's interested. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, and on that note, our first episode today is going to be about to be or not to be deliberate. And I'm interested to hear your thoughts and ideas on this, Abe, as this is more a topic you introduced to both of us.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time thinking about how I want to use my time. I guess, I was born with a heart murmur, a structural defect in my heart, and it's always made me very conscious of how much time I have here. Not that I should have any less because of this. Like every cardiologist I've ever been to is like, this is not what's going to kill you. But it's something that I've had my whole life. And so it's made me just really very appreciative of this time, both my own time and just kind of the miracle of the people who are here at the same time, right? The universe is big and infinite in time and space. And we just, the odds that we're here together are, close to zero on the grand scheme of things. And, I definitely have been deliberate in choosing to, family, career, wanting to make sure I'm making the most of my time. And Sam, I thought it was very interesting that you seem like you've been very deliberate. You chose to retire, you chose to really think about how you're spending time. So it's funny that you say that you're not deliberate.
Well, I would say this, I actually distinguish between time and attention. And they can kind of be, there's a lot of overlap between the two. But for me, I don't care as much about my time as I do what's my attention on. And just an example is if I watch, let's say I read a quick news snippet first thing in the morning, like I open up my cell phone in the morning and I read a news snippet on, ex-President Donald Trump. And whatever that snippet says, that might hijack my attention several times throughout the day. So to me, it's not just that time where I was reading, but it's also my mind is being hijacked. And so I'm not being very deliberate in that situation. I've just allowed something to hijack my attention at various points throughout the day. And in that particular example, I doubt I would get much value out of my attention being on whatever news story about Trump I might have read.
Are you deliberate about like how much news you take in, or how you start those, little instances that might lead to your attention being grabbed?
Yeah, that's a great question. I personally feel that I try to be, and we talked a little bit about this. Every app on your phone is trying to keep your attention as long as possible, and they have metrics on the other end of all these apps exactly measuring your engagement, which is another word for your attention. So if you're not being very engaged, they're trying different things to get you more engaged. And they're only successful as a company if they're getting lots of people engaged. So I feel like we're fighting that, and so I'm losing that fight at times.
Yeah.
And I do often, first thing in the morning, I'll open up my phone app and I'll check my stock. Not only do I see my stock, but I see all the news stories associated with the different stocks that I'm interested in. And I'll read those news stories, and that's not being very deliberate. Then I'm allowing my morning to be hijacked by that information. Other mornings I am deliberate. So to me, it's a constant battle, and it's one that I lose often.
Yeah, I think it's important to be deliberate about, I think of time and attention really similarly. I try to put my phone down somewhat time between 7 and 8 at night. And the first thing in my morning happens to be my children asking for breakfast. So I am at least, delayed from getting to the phone. But I do think a lot about how I'm spending my time. And I often reflect kind of real time, like, is this a good use of my time? That's kind of a process I just have running in my mind, whether that's, yeah, and some, that can be, rest is good. I'm trying to, optimize across, my physical health, my mental health, my work, my friendships, being a good spouse, being a good parent, being a good member of my community. All those things are important. I left out spirituality. You and I have talked about this. I feel like there's a real spiritual deficit I experience, but I don't feel a pull on that. But I do think about that. Like, should I be more deliberate?
If you had to guess and you summed up all the time in 2022 where you asked yourself that question and you had to guess, what percentage of the time do you think your answer was, yes, this is a good use of my time? And what percentage do you think it was no? And what percentage is, maybe
Yeah,
kind
no,
of gray area or you don't really know?
it's fair. 82% of the time, I feel like I'm using my time well. Um, there are, and that other 18%, I think it's often attention grab, or sometimes it's just, loss of control that you mentioned. Sometimes I get overtired, like, and I can't go to sleep. And I'm like, this actually happened to me last night. This is a miserable use of time. Like, how do I just, get myself in a good state? And sometimes, so that was just being conscious of, and I think we'll cover forgiveness on another episode, which is, I had been ready to go to bed earlier. I had to pick up a kid late. I got overtired. I'm excited about this episode. And, I just got into a state, which was, not a great state. Those things happen rarely. I have a lot of tools that I try to use to manage those. But again, I try to be deliberate and reflect and move on and do better. So, one of the things we're going to talk about is like circumstance, right? So being deliberate about your circumstance. And you mentioned this, like, if your circumstances, you wake up, you check your stock, there's news things, you're creating a circumstance that's going to, in some ways, dictate how you spend your time. And I think a lot about circumstance. It's one of the reasons, like, I was very happy to move from the country to a city. There's more opportunity. That circumstance just creates, more opportunities to become one's best self on a number of axes. So, I do think a lot about people I meet. I'd like to learn. I think you can learn something from everybody. You learn more things from other people, especially people who are also in a growth mindset. So I'm curious how you found.
Can I ask for a few? Can I ask for a few examples of circumstance? So when you said that, one example that came to my mind is if you go to college and let's say your major is science, some science, your circumstance is that you're seeing a lot of experiments, you're seeing a lot of theory, not just from historical scientists, but also in your labs and maybe your own personal research. So your circumstance, you're creating these opportunities to not just learn about science, but actually do science, versus if you're just not going to college and you don't have a lab at home, and maybe you watch a YouTube video once a week on science. So you're not really giving yourself circumstance to be a scientist. Is that kind of what you mean by circumstance? Or is that one example?
It's one example, and it comes up all the time, whether that's in learning. I mean, it's something like, why go to the gym as opposed to exercising at home? Well, there's just, you might learn things from other people. There's a little bit of, almost pressure to perform, for lack of a better word. And, how do you find motivation? So meaning, right? So we do things, people tend to do things because they're interested in them, because they have meaning. So what's the motivation is an important thing. And circumstance can provide those opportunities. It can influence motivation. There's just, I think, a lot of things to consider when you're choosing where you spend your time and who you spend your time with.
Ooh, this is my first MIT versus Caltech moment. I really want to challenge some ideas about meaning. And it's because I personally don't find motivation through meaning. And I'm not a nihilist. For those of you who don't know, nihilism is this idea that nothing matters, so there's no point to anything. So that's nihilism, and that's pretty extreme for me. I'm not saying that. I'm more agnostic, whereas I don't know if meaning matters. I really don't know. And I certainly, more power to you if you find meaning in things. Like, wonderful for you. Just know that there are some of us who don't really identify with meaning, and I'm one of them. And I saw a paper recently that I could cite and put in the comments that talked about people who just learn for a lifelong, a life of learning is equivalent to them for versus people who have meaning. In other words, someone who has this thing where they just keep learning and learning, they might find as much satisfaction and gratification in life as someone who's fulfilling their life purpose. And what I loved about that is when I was growing up, I was taught this idea that you need to find your life's purpose. You need to find meaning in what you're doing. And if you don't, then you're somehow kind of a lesser. And I like that people are challenging that, because I haven't personally identified with needing to find meaning. Again, if you find meaning, awesome, more power to you. I'm not commenting on people finding meaning, just more that this concept of, hey, everyone has to find meaning. And I know Viktor Frankl, he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning, and it was so important to him, he even found meaning in suffering. And he created a whole side of psychology based on how, if you find meaning in life, it'll help your mental health, it'll help your emotional well-being. And so he really thinks meaning is super important. But for me, meaning is not an important pursuit. I actually identified, when I read that article on knowledge, I very much identified with that article that a life of learning would be enough for me. So I just wanted to float that out there, Abe. I think meaning is important to you, and so I'm kind of
Yeah.
curious your thoughts on
Well,
hearing all that.
it's super important to me. And yeah, I like I read the Viktor Frankl book, Man's Search for Meaning, and in his reflection at the end of that book, he says that, you know, it was important for him to discover his purpose in life, which was helping other people find their purpose in life. And I definitely think, for me, and when I reflect on when I was young, and there were definitely times.
And sorry, he created an entire field of psychology,
Yeah,
very successfully.
yeah, and I think that, so for me in my life, I think and in my own mind, I have a lot of parts of myself, and I definitely noticed, particularly like my freshman year of college. You know, I was doing classes, I was a good student, so the classes didn't take up a lot of time, and I was meeting a lot of people and having a lot of fun, and I had a lot of fun for a whole year. And I look back on that and I was like, that was fun. But as I look back on that whole year, I kind of feel like that year was a waste. So
Which year was this?
my freshman year of college.
Your freshman year of college.
In terms of, you know, I grew academically, but that was about it. I had spent a lot of time with people and relationships. And, you know, it didn't feel at all satisfying in reflection as much as it felt satisfying on any given day. And so for me, that was a moment where I was like, it's important for me to make sure that, you know, what I'm doing within my days is enjoyable, but also contributes to meaning as I reflect back over the long term. So for me, that was super important, because I felt very bad when I reflected and felt like I had wasted my time. And as we talked about before, I feel like this time is so precious. And so, you know, this journey has continued over time, but, you know, I was much more focused on what I wanted to, or what was meaningful to me. So, you know, it took some time to put words to it, but the words I use today are, you know, the thing that gives me the most meaning is helping people I care about accomplish the things that are important to them. And that's been a good aligning tool for me, whether that was as an engineer, as an investment manager, as a husband, as a parent, as a friend, as a member of my community, that, you know, I like to, in whatever way I can, contribute to things that the people I care about find important. And, you know, I get a lot of meaning out of that, and it's very motivating, and it moves me forward. And I guess the other thing I should mention about my freshman year is I felt kind of slothful at times, kind of just like, you know, lost and wallowing. and it wasn't, I wasn't moving toward my best health, whether that's mentally or physically. And I had that sense. I was in a fraternity my freshman year at MIT. MIT at the time let freshmen live off campus, and I recognized that that circumstance was not constructive for me. So I moved out my sophomore year. Like, not a lot of people move out of their living groups at MIT generally, let alone just after their freshman year. So I was very deliberate about, I need to be in a better circumstance, right? The circumstance I'm in, as much as I love a lot of my fraternity brothers, was not, motivating me to be my best self. So yeah, and meaning is super, it is super important for me, because I know for me it's a motivator. And I think that, like, the wonderful thing about human beings and the nice thing about having this discussion and the great thing about meeting you and talking with you is, right, you live this life of learning without really depending on this long-term, like a particular goal, right? This idea of purpose within life. And I think that that's neat.
Actually, let me clarify. I lived a very goal-driven life, like extremely goal-driven, and loved that life. And for anyone who wants to try it, I would definitely say it was a great part of my life. And it just, having goals and having meaning, I think, are two different things.
Mm-hmm.
And meaning is pushed on us so hard. I feel like there's a little bit of brainwashing, because the concept is, hey, or the assumption is, if you don't find meaning, you're not going to have this fulfilling life. And the research doesn't support that. But that idea has been foisted on me my whole life. But separately from meaning, I loved having goals. And then, to me, once I had the goal, it was just a matter of incrementally each day, pushing the needle in a certain direction, especially for graduate work. That's a 5-year research project. So you have all these ideas, and as long as you're moving forward in the right direction, like, you don't get your PhD in 1 day of experiments, you get it over the course of years. And so there's a lot of trial and error, and a lot of goal setting and a lot of pivoting. You have certain goals, and then you have to change those goals based on where you are. So I wouldn't conflate goal setting with meaning. I think you can have a life of goals without having meaning.
Now, for me, it's a motivate. I think it's super. So I discovered within myself is it's just super. It's a super important motivational construct, right? So your mind is always deciding where to focus your attention, right? Exactly what you mentioned before. And the way my mind is constructed, goals are important, but meaning is actually more important. So I would say I'm a more empathetic, emotional person, certainly by any personality test I've ever taken. And so this idea of connecting with meaning is just important in my mind to keep me on task. So it helps reduce cognitive fatigue in any endeavor, because it's just because sometimes so my mind, my mind's running on a lot of tracks. There's a lot of things that could take my attention, that are vying for my attention. And so for me, it is super helpful when my mind says, why are you doing this? For me to say, because it's important to all the parts of me, because this is meaningful, right? So for me, so if life doesn't have meaning for me, then there's no reason to do anything. It is the short of it, because I'm very future focused. So I think this is something we'll talk about maybe another time, like trying to live in the present. You strike me as a person who's able to live very much in the present. That's something that I'm trying to do more. It's because, again, all the studies say it's the best way to live. And I'm all for trying to live better, but it's very hard for me. I'm very aware of my future self and wanting to serve my future self well and create the best future self I can. And those things for me are all motivated by meaning.
Yeah, I think actually that's one reason sports are so popular. And I think you've talked about being a pilot, is in sports, you're kind of forced to be present. If you're not present, things are happening still and you're not responding well. It's not to say that sports are the best way to be present. It's just one like you said, a circumstance that kind of forces you to be present. So using your language, if you're putting yourself in circumstances that require you to be present, maybe it's a little easier. I love that I give off the impression that I'm present. It's certainly something I feel like I'm failing at a lot more than I'm succeeding, but I'm failing usually in ways that, if you're trying to get better at anything, failure is a part of that road to success. And I feel like I'm in the failure stage, and I think I'll always be in the failure stage. And I'm okay with that, because I do feel each failure is teaching me something, and maybe I'm getting slightly better at it. But it's certainly not at all something I find that is easy for me. But it's certainly a worthwhile endeavor for me to be present.
Moving back to deliberate or not deliberate, right? So I'm a huge fan of deliberate, which is being, thoughtful about where you are, why you're there. And what do you think about being deliberate versus, or where to be deliberate versus where not to be deliberate even?
Yeah, so you talked about one thing, which is who you surround yourself with. I couldn't agree more. Who you surround yourself with really matters. I think there's a Chinese proverb. I know someone who's Chinese told me it's a Chinese proverb, but I haven't verified this online. But they said, if you want to get to know someone, just look at their 5 closest friends. And basically you're an amalgam, you're a mix of your 5 closest friends. And I'm not saying that's true, but I think there is some truth in that statement, that you are kind of who you surround yourself with. And if you surround yourself with people you don't like, you still pick up their habits, even if you don't like their habits. So I think that was one point that you were bringing up already, is that who you surround yourself with really influences you. And so be deliberate about who you're around. If you're constantly surrounded by people you don't like, that can be a challenge. And I think that when I was first starting into philanthropy, that was a challenge I had, as I was surrounding myself with people who all their language is about how unhealthy they were, all the different diseases they had, all the different stuff they were struggling with. And that was becoming my world, was like all this disease that this person's living through. And, it's all like the victim mentality, and there's nothing they can do about it. And, it was hard for me to be around that so much without it really influencing me. So it really made me think, hey, philanthropy it's hard, right? And that's one of the challenges. If you're truly getting in and helping individuals, you're around them and your attention's on them. And so then, who you're around matters. You asked, like, where else are you deliberate? Is that right?
Yeah, I'm very curious where you're deliberate.
Yeah, I think who you're around. For me, I'm very deliberate about what is my attention on, even more so than my time. I keep coming back to that. So I don't find, if I'm reading news or watching news, I don't find that that is particularly useful. And I'll still do it. For example, the war happening in Ukraine right now is just, I can't avoid looking at it for very long. So in my mind, I'm like, well, I'm not doing anything, so I shouldn't pay attention. But then bam, I'll find myself really like trying to tune into different aspects of that war, trying to understand the information that is going to the average Russian citizen. But the place where I really get stuck is like imagining if I were a soldier on either side, right? Like, I think it must be a horrible experience for the soldiers on either side of that war. And so I'm watching these videos that are generally from the soldiers themselves, and I'm just seeing an English translation. So I don't know how much information I'm getting exactly, and I don't know if I can verify that these are actual soldiers. But what I'm seeing is that it is like a living hell for both sides, and the amount of confusion, the amount of friendly fire, the conditions, it just sounds, and that's all if you survive, right? That's not even mentioning getting injured or getting killed. And I can't stop looking at that. And I think I am open to allowing that to be a part of me, just because it seems like such an important thing that's happening right now. But I don't know. I don't know if it's useful.
Yeah,
In
no,
general, I
I'm
avoid the
deliberate the
news.
opposite way on the war in Ukraine. I feel like having read Holocaust history and how the Nazis treated the Jews, I've had my fill of empathy for the brutality of humanity. So I'm not consuming a lot of the war for the information from the war in Ukraine. So one of the things that we talked about also was just being deliberate about purchases, like how you go about, let's say, buying a phone.
Oh, yeah.
And
Right.
I'm a fan of, my biggest deliberation in the new phone I just got was, should I switch from Android to iPhone? And I just put that out to my social networks, asked everybody what they thought, spent 20 minutes on calls with a few different people just to nail down some things, and then just bought the most popular Android phone. So that whole process took around 30 minutes. And I'm a fan for tools, especially for things that are popular. You can just look at the highest rated one and get it, and do not spend a lot of time deliberating or necessarily even learning about all the ins and outs and features.
Yeah, and I think the note you put in our notes is that these decisions about a technology purchase are often over deliberated and not consequential. I might be getting
Yeah,
the words
that's
not
a fair
exactly right.
paraphrase. Yep.
And I had written, like, actually, another Caltech versus MIT moment is, in Montana, when I just retired, the first thing I did is I drove up to Montana, Western Montana, and just beautiful. And I met a ton of lovely people. And one of the people I met, he also retired young, and he loved to mow his lawn. And I was like, what? Like, that's manual labor. Why would you? And he pointed out all these things that now I enjoy mowing my lawn. And I think I always did. And I just had accepted people's kind of ideas that, oh, that's menial labor, you shouldn't enjoy that. And once he phrased his perspective, it resonated with me, which is, one, while you're doing it, it's often just gratifying to be, doing the physical labor, which is totally true. I love, using my body. I'm a very kinesthetic person, so I like going through space with my body. And two, you see the results. Like a freshly mown lawn has a very specific look to it, and you see that. And so in a 20-minute time span, you've changed a landscape, and it can be very beautiful. And after hearing that perspective, I was like, yeah, it's okay to celebrate these. It's a menial task. You're not accomplishing anything really. You're certainly, I can't imagine there's much meaning in having a mowed lawn, right? But it is gratifying work. And so similarly, I told you that when I was a young kid, that's back when computers didn't even have hard drives, right? And then when the first hard drive came out, it was like 20 megabytes, literally megabytes, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that seemed huge at the time, like 20 mega, we were like megabytes. And then, I kept abreast of the information, and we had our 20 megabyte computer, and then we graduated to an 80 megabyte hard drive computer. And I did a lot of research, and I wanted to make sure, hey, when we move to this new computer, that we're getting the best. But the value I gained from this was, that's how I learned about technology and how quickly it was advancing. Because not only do all the megabytes and megahertz go up, so this storage size and the speed goes up, but the relative price goes way down, right? Like the price per megabyte plummets super fast. So like the 80 megabyte hard drive costs the same as the 20 megabyte did, a year ago or whatever it was. And so for me, just seeing Moore's law in reality, that just our technology is doubling or it's growing exponentially, is, to me, that was what made it worth looking at these different technology decisions. Because I only buy a new phone like once every 4 or 5 years, but I do the research every year to see like what gains have they made in the past year.
Yeah,
So
so there's a
we're
few things here that you
very
brought up
different
about
there.
the mowing lawns in Montana and the deliberation or the learning about technology. We're the same age. I remember 1989 very well myself. I remember getting my 40 megabit hard drive, and I could fit, there's no way they'll make enough King's Quests for me to fill this hard drive, right? And from the learning aspect, so I totally agree with time spent on learning, especially tools that are generalizable, instantiable, and extensible, as I've talked about before, right? So, I mean, I had an Apple IIe, unless that would have been like 1985, 86, right? And programming in Logo, and then on to the PC world. I actually ran a dial and bulletin board system when I was a teenager, so I learned coding in C at that time. And those were all super useful things to learn. I built several computers along the way. And I remember what was the big thick catalog of all the computer parts? It was a Compu something. But yeah, but I never spent, I just, again, even then, I didn't spend a lot of time on exactly which hard drive, which monitor. Yeah, because everything was comparably, you could do a quick look, comparable prices, comparable specs. So for me, if it's within 10%, I absolutely don't care. I'm just
I see.
gonna move on, because I want to spend my time, learning, doing, enjoying, meeting people, all of those things. So, and I'm very particular. I try to identify very quickly, like, is this something that's generalizable or is it trivia, right? So I'm not a big fan of collecting trivial information in my mind, right? Limited amount of time, attention, storage space, especially these days. If I know I can Google it, I'll just let it pass through my mind, very, very purposefully, there. And again, on the time thing, it's for me personally, I would not be like, so I've had plenty of mowing lawn experiences. I understand the aesthetics. I understand the beauty of the process and the result and of creation, but especially for things like the grass grows, you're going to do this again. I mean, I have 3 children, the oldest of whom is 18, the youngest of whom is 15. I've done a lot of like fixing and watching things get broken down. That's like my whole day. So I'm glad I've had that experience. I've learned a lot. It's very relatable for people who have kids. But I am totally happy to have somebody else mow the lawn, right? Make me food. Like, I like cooking. I learn it in a bunch of cooking techniques, but I'm also happy to go out and have a nice fine dining experience. And would probably do that all the time, time and money permitting, so that again I could focus on the things that have more meaning for me. So that's where I come down on that.
I really like one thing you said a moment ago, which is if something is easily referenceable via Google, it's not necessarily going to take up space in your mind. You can let it go. And there is this concept of forgetting. So when you're a 5-year-old child or a 6-year-old child, it's all about remembering everything, right? There's games called memory, and everyone's rewarding you for remembering things. And remembering is so important for a kid. But that's because in life, you don't have much experience. And the opposite starts to happen, which is as you age, you don't need to remember as much because you already have kind of the basics. You got the basic wiring already. But forgetting actually starts to become really important. Unfortunately, as a society, we don't value forgetting. If I go and I interact with a human and I've forgotten some things about them, like, they're kind of bummed out. But the reality is, I'm like you. I think I subscribe to the idea that it's healthy to forget. And actually, the more you age, I think the more important it is to forget. And our brains aren't hard drives, but if you think about them like a hard drive, if you fill up a hard drive, it stops working very well. If you've got a hard drive that's 98% full, good luck getting that hard drive to do anything. It just can't. It's just bloated and it can't do anything. If it's 90% full, it can kind of function. If it's 10% full, it's lightning fast. And our brains, they're not exactly the same, but I do believe that as you get older, you can be deliberate about what you remember. And thank you, Abe. What a fun day. I really appreciated this chance to talk to you and to see our sometimes different perspectives and sometimes supportive perspectives.
And the different words. I think one of the things I love about talking with you is you just try so hard to understand and find examples and relatable examples. So it's really pleasure, and super thankful for you and this opportunity.
All right. Well, enjoy the rest of your day.
You too. And
Take
we'll
care.
talk again soon.
All right. Take care, everyone.